In the gospel reading from last week, we learned that Jesus had returned to Galilee, and he had been invited to preach in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth. This was a really big deal for the people, for they had heard of his healing and the miracles he had performed in the surrounding country. And the eyes of all were fixed on him in the synagogue. The crowd was Jewish, and Jesus was a Jew, one who knew well the Hebrew Scriptures and the laws concerning their lives and worship, as had been set forth in the first 5 books of the Bible. And probably this was a very lively crowd, with big smiles and warm handshakes all around. They were excited. Conversations may have gone something like this. Our boy Jesus is here. Have you heard about all the great things he has done in Capernaum? No doubt he'll come to us with some great ideas and will praise us for the good work we've done here and congratulate us on how well we are adhering to the purity laws and looking for ways to penalize those who break them. Maybe he'll show us a trick or two. Maybe make us some of that fine new wine from those jugs of water. The people are proud of themselves and their piety, and they want some recognition from this hometown boy. Jesus, however, did not preach what they wanted to hear. Rather than feeding their egos and complimenting them for their works, he told them stories about how the prophets that had gone before him, Elijah and Elisha, had worked in ways that extended God's favor and mercy to non-Jews, even lepers and outcasts, people they would not have even been considered to let into the synagogues. How could he speak like this in his hometown to God's chosen people? How could he align himself with pagans and Gentiles and those considered unclean in the eyes of the Jewish law? The crowd therefore became enraged, and they tried to throw Jesus off the cliff, but he escaped. Jesus' message was true and consistent and reflected the love that God has for all people, regardless of their position of rank in the church, their net worth, their standing in social circles, or their family lineage. Rather than letting the people be satisfied with the status quo and their idolatrous adherence to church law, which often benefited the rich at the expense of the poor, Jesus was setting an example by which social, economic, and political boundaries may be broken down. His teachings and his actions call for new ways of interpreting the laws of the land, ways in which the primary motivation should be love and mercy and justice for all. In other New Testament stories, the actions that Jesus would take with the woman at the well, the Syrophoenician woman with a daughter who was possessed by a demon, and the blind beggar whose sight he restored, all reflect the ways in which his predecessors, Elijah and Elisha, also reached out to those on the margins of society, those who would have been ignored by the religious authorities. The situation in Luke's gospel is very similar to that in the reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And those verses contain some of the most beautiful words in the Bible. They are poetic, they are poignant, and they are properly read at weddings, where the bride and groom are reminded that love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or rude. It does not insist on its own way. Love never ends. I never fail to be greatly moved by hearing those words at a wedding and feel like renewing my own vows with the bride of 37 years sitting next to me. She's right over there. The Apostle Paul, however, did not intend such a mushy interpretation of his words, beautiful as they were. Like the Jewish people in the synagogue in Nazareth, the Christians in Corinth had become self-serving, often abusing their own religious freedom and scorning any spiritual gifts that their neighbors may have had while basking in the glow of their own perceived gifts. Many in the church at Corinth sought desperately to have recognition for themselves and for gaining appointments to high positions in the church. Paul, like Jesus before him, would have none of that. His message was that unless the good acts that they did in the name of the church could be done in the spirit of love, then all of their talk, their knowledge, their piety, their sacrifices at the altar amounted to nothing in the eyes of God. Without love, they would be like noisy gongs or clanging cymbals. Without love, those Christians would be like the salt that Jesus described as having lost its savor, good for nothing except being trampled underfoot. Although there may be a sentimental element to the love that Paul describes, it is also a love that is active and tough and resilient and possibly long-suffering. It calls us to speak the truth in love and to confront others when we see that they may have strayed from the path that God intended, and to remind them of God's transforming love and mercy. So how do we take with us the love that Paul advised and Jesus embodied into our chaotic and often violent world today? What characteristics in the leaders of our government do we need to see in order to elect them to the offices where they will guide us in our public actions and policies? How do we construct and enforce our laws so that they offer maximum security and protection for all of our citizens, but at the same time address the needs of the disadvantaged and the marginalized? How can we comfort and accept those who have fled from their own houses in countries where they have been abused and they are seeking asylum in our country? How do we address the ways in which we must be protected from terrorists disguised as innocent immigrants? The answers to these questions are not easily determined, but Jesus and Paul are asking us to acknowledge all of these realities in our world, a world where the lowly among us are looked down upon, where the poor sleep in cardboard boxes under freeways, where captives remain in prisons, and where there is an ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Jesus and Paul want us to look around us with love and compassion, to see the lonely, those suffering illness or loss, those in the throes of depression, or those who through no fault of their own are unable to help themselves. Jesus and Paul would urge us to eliminate any restrictions or boundaries that prevent us from ministering to all of those, or anything else that separates us from the intentions that God has for us. Faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Beautiful words that do accentuate the sacred bonds of matrimony. But our prayer should be for God to give us the strength and courage to accept and to implement this in all of our lives, carrying it with us daily in this complex world. Amen.